Cale Hargrove had been buying junk in space for 6 years, and he had never once found anything worth bragging about. That was the life of a human scrap trader in a galaxy that barely tolerated humans at all. He sat in the auction hall of Station Grieve 14, a rusted orbital platform floating at the edge of Council space, where broken ships and dead satellites came to be sold for parts. The hall smelled like engine grease and burnt ozone, and the seats were designed for species with wider hips and longer legs, so Cale had to sit sideways just to stay comfortable. Around him sat dozens of alien buyers from a handful of species, all of them watching the auctioneer, a tall Draith female with 4 arms and a voice like a grinding engine, as she listed lot after lot of orbital debris. Lot 7749, she announced. Decommissioned Salvari patrol frigate. Hull intact, engine salvageable, starting bid 14,000 galactic standard. Immediately, Cale did not raise his hand because he could not afford 14,000 of anything. He was here for the cheap lots, the ones nobody wanted, the bins of twisted metal and charred wiring that bigger traders considered beneath them. His ship, the Rust Bucket, was a converted cargo freighter held together by welding patches and stubbornness, and he made his living by finding small treasures in piles of garbage. It was not glamorous work, but it kept him fed and it kept him flying, and for a human in this part of the galaxy, that was enough. Humans were what the Galactic Concord called a provisional species, which was a polite way of saying they were considered too young and too dangerous to be trusted with anything important. They were restricted from advanced weapons, and forbidden from owning military-grade ships, and absolutely banned from going anywhere near anything classified as Mythic grade. Mythic ships were the legends of the galaxy, ancient vessels from an era called the Elder Epoch, built by a civilization that had vanished millions of years before any current species had learned to walk upright. No one could replicate their technology, and no one fully understood how they worked, and only the 3 ascendant races, the Salvari, the Draith, and the Omur, were even allowed to study them. A human caught looking at a mythic artifact could be arrested, and a human caught touching one could simply disappear. Cale had no interest in mythic ships, because he had a strong interest in staying alive. Lot 7751, the auctioneer called out in a bored voice, unsorted orbital debris, recovered from Grid 77, irradiated, manifest lists mixed composites and dead electronics, starting bid 200 standard. Nobody raised a hand. 100 standard. Still nothing. The auctioneer's 4 arms folded with irritation. 50 standard, and I remind the hull that the hauling company has the right of first refusal. Fee is non-refundable, regardless. Cale raised his hand because 50 standard for a bulk lot was practically free, and sometimes irradiated junk contained rare metals that could be cleaned and resold at a profit. Sold to the human, the auctioneer said without enthusiasm. Cale smiled and made a note on his datapad. 3 hours later, he was back on the Rust Bucket, guiding the tow cables as they hauled the massive lot into his cargo hold. The debris was ugly, a fused mass of scorched metal and shattered hull plating, roughly the size of a small building, tumbling slowly in the zero gravity of the hold. "Bridge," Cale called out. "Run a standard composition scan on the new lot and tell me if there is anything worth pulling apart." Bridge was his ship's artificial intelligence, and calling it his was generous, because Bridge had a personality that made it feel more like an unwanted roommate than a tool. Cale had built Bridge himself from salvaged processing cores and illegal software patches, and the result was an AI that was smarter than it should be, and far more opinionated than anyone had asked for. "Scanning now," Bridge replied, its voice carrying the tone of someone doing a favor they expected to regret. Initial results show standard ferric composites, carbon scoring consistent with atmospheric re-entry, trace amounts of weight. Cale looked up from the cable winch. "Wait, what?" I am detecting an anomaly in the center of the mass, Bridge said, and for the first time in the 6 years Cale had known the AI, its voice carried something that sounded like genuine concern. The outer debris is radiating as expected, but there is a structure inside that is not emitting radiation at all. It is emitting structured data. Structured data from inside a ball of junk. That is what I said, Cale, and I would appreciate it if you would take a moment to consider how unusual that is. Cutting torch, and pulled himself through the zero-gravity hold toward the mass. It took him 20 minutes to cut through the outer layers of fused metal, peeling back sheets of scorched plating and dead wiring like the skin of some enormous fruit. And then he saw it. Underneath all that garbage, buried like a secret someone had tried very hard to hide, there was a ship. It was small, barely Corvette-sized, and its hull was black in a way that seemed to drink the light around it. The surface was covered in geometric patterns, angular lines, and interlocking shapes that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves whenever Cale was not looking directly at them. He froze. He had never seen a mythic ship in person, but every spacefaring human had seen pictures and read the warnings, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. Bridge, he whispered. I know, Bridge said, and now the AI's voice was not just concerned, it was afraid. A mythic vessel, and that is a mythic vessel, and we need to leave right now, because if anyone detects that signature, we are not going to prison, we are going to stop existing. Cale knew Bridge was right. He knew that every law in the Concord said he should dump this thing back into space, and fly away, and never speak of it again. He knew that the Salvari had killed people for less, but he did not move, because the geometric patterns on the hull had stopped shifting. They were rearranging themselves slowly and deliberately into a new shape, a shape that Cale recognized immediately because he saw it every day of his life. It was a handprint, a human handprint. Cale reached out and pressed his palm against the hull, and the metal was warm, not hot, not cold, but warm like skin. Warm like something alive. Warm like something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. The patterns rippled outward from his hand like waves in dark water, and the entire ship hummed with a sound so low he felt it in his chest more than he heard it. Bridge was saying something, probably something urgent, and probably something smart. But Cale was not listening. He was staring at the ship that the galaxy said he was not allowed to touch. The ship that had just recognized him. It was waiting for me, he said quietly. And deep inside the ancient vessel, something that had been sleeping for 3 million years opened its eyes. Cale did not sleep that night. He spent 7 hours moving the mythic ship deeper into the rust bucket's cargo hold, welding false panels around it, layering scrap metal over its hull to disguise its shape, and running every masking protocol Bridge had ever invented to hide its energy signature from outside sensors. I want to be very clear, Bridge said as Cale worked, that what we are doing right now is not just illegal, it is the kind of illegal that does not have a trial attached to it. I know. The Concord does not arrest people who possess mythic artifacts, Cale, they erase them. And I mean that in every sense of the word. Your records, your identity, your biological existence, all of it removed, as though you never happened. I know, Bridge. And yet you are currently welding a decorative panel over the most dangerous object in the galaxy, as though you are hiding a birthday present. Cale finished the last weld and floated back to admire his work. The cargo hold looked like it always did, a mess of junk and spare parts, with nothing remarkable about it. Underneath all of it, the mythic ship waited. He had to go inside. He knew it was stupid, and he knew it was dangerous, and he knew that every rational thought in his head was telling him to dump the ship into the nearest star and forget he ever saw it. But the handprint on the hull had not been random. The ship had recognized him, not just as a living creature, but as something specific, something it had been designed to find. And Cale Hargrove had spent his whole life being told by the galaxy that humans were not special, that they were too young and too crude, and too reckless to be trusted with anything that mattered. So when an ancient ship looked at him and said, "You are the one I have been waiting for," he was not going to walk away from that. The airlock opened at his touch, not with a mechanical grinding or a hydraulic hiss, but silently, the hull simply parting like water to let him through, and then closing behind him as though it had never been open at all. The interior was dark at first, but then light began to grow, not from any visible source, but from the walls themselves, a soft, warm glow that moved with him as he walked, illuminating the space ahead and dimming the space behind, as though the ship was watching where he looked and lighting his path accordingly. The corridor was strange. It was not built in straight lines like human ships, or in the curved organic shapes favored by the Drythe. Instead, it seemed to exist in angles that should not have been possible, corners that turned in directions his eyes could not quite follow, spaces that felt larger on the inside than they could possibly be based on the ship's exterior dimensions. And the walls were alive. Not biologically, there was no flesh or membrane or anything organic about them, but they responded to him the way a living thing would respond to a trusted companion. When he stumbled in the low gravity, the floor shifted to catch him. When the air felt too cold, warmth radiated from the surfaces around him. When he realized he was thirsty after hours of work, a section of wall beside him softened and reshaped itself into a shallow basin, and clean water pooled inside it, as though it had been squeezed from the metal itself. "Bridge," Kale said through his comlink. "Are you getting the data streams from in here?" "I am," Bridge replied, and the AI's voice was different now, not frightened, but fascinated, in a way that Kale had never heard before. "And I need to tell you something that is going to sound impossible. More impossible than a ship that makes water out of walls. The data patterns this vessel is emitting, I have been trying to decode them, and most of it is beyond anything I can process. But there are fragments, small, repeating sequences. And Kale, they are not alien." "What do you mean?" "I mean they match human linguistic structures. Not modern languages, but deep structures, proto-symbolic patterns that resemble ancient Earth writing systems. And I do not mean one system, I mean several simultaneously. Patterns that look like Sumerian cuneiform, an Aboriginal Australian songline notation, and Norse runic frameworks, all layered on top of each other, as though someone took every root language humanity ever created and wove them into a single communication protocol." Kale stopped walking. "That is not possible," he said. "I am aware of that," Bridge replied, "and yet it is what the data shows." Kale kept moving deeper into the ship until he found a chamber at its center, larger than any room the ship's exterior should have been able to contain, with a high ceiling that faded into shadow, and walls lined with geometric patterns that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. In the middle of the room sat a chair. It was not exactly a chair, it was a structure that resembled a throne, rising from the floor as though it had grown there, surrounded by a ring of empty space where the air itself seemed to shimmer. When Kale stepped into the ring, the room exploded with light. A holographic star map burst into existence around him. Thousands of stars, millions of them, filling the chamber with a galaxy rendered in perfect glowing detail. But it was wrong. The stars were not where they should be. They were in positions they would have occupied millions of years ago, before stellar drift and gravitational shifts had rearranged the sky into the map Kale knew. And one star was highlighted, pulsing with a golden light, brighter than all the others. Sol, Earth's sun. Kale stared at it, and the ship began to speak to him. Not in words. The ship did not use language the way any living species did. In impressions, emotional data transmitted directly into his awareness, like memories that belonged to someone else. He felt recognition, the overwhelming sensation of finding something that had been lost for so long that the search itself had become a kind of prayer. He felt relief, the exhaustion of patience finally rewarded. He felt sorrow, deep and ancient and heavy, the grief of a parent who had sent a child into the world knowing they would not be there to see them grow. And he felt urgency, a warning, quiet but insistent, that this reunion was not happening in safety, that others would come, that the moment of finding was also the moment of danger. Cale sat down on the floor of the chamber because his legs would not hold him anymore. The ship had been waiting. Not for a species, for his species. Not for any creature smart enough to find it, for humans specifically. It had been buried in scrap and hidden in junk for centuries or millennia, and it had waited with the patience of something that measured time in epochs rather than years. And now it had found what it was looking for. 12 star systems away, on the Selvari administrative world of Seth Bastur, a records clerk named Doeth Vasra was reviewing auction logs from Station Grieve 14. It was tedious work, the kind of task assigned to junior officials who had not yet earned the right to do anything interesting, and she had been scanning lot manifests for hours without finding a single irregularity. Until lot 7751. The energy decay readings did not match the listed contents. Irradiated debris should show a predictable decay curve, but this lot's readings contained a spike, brief and faint, but unmistakable to anyone trained to look for it, that matched no known radiation profile. It matched a mythic energy signature. Doeth Vasra felt her blood go cold. She cross-referenced the buyer and found a name that made the cold spread deeper. A human had purchased a lot containing a mythic signature object. She opened a priority channel to the Selvari Admiralty, and when the face of Admiral Sorvan appeared on her screen, she delivered her report with a voice that did not shake, only because she was too frightened to allow it. One of the unchosen species has a seed ship, Admiral. The Admiral's face changed, not with anger, but with something far worse. Something that looked like a fear he had carried for a very long time, finally being confirmed. Which species? Doeth Vasra swallowed. The humans. Admiral Sorvan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with the weight of someone who understood that the galaxy had just changed forever. Then it is already too late to stop it. Cale returned to the central chamber every day for a week. Each time the ship revealed more of itself to him, peeling back layers of dormant systems like an ancient book turning its own pages. And each time, Bridge translated what it could from the cascading data streams, while admitting freely that most of it was beyond anything the AI had ever encountered. On the 7th day, the command throne activated fully. Cale had been sitting in the chamber, studying the star map, when the throne began to glow from within, its geometric surface patterns shifting into alignment, like tumblers in a lock. And a new projection appeared above it. Not stars this time, but symbols, dense and layered, arranged in sequences that Bridge immediately began to parse. "This is an archive," Bridge said, and the AI's voice was quiet in a way that meant it was processing something enormous. A historical record left by the species that built this vessel. The architects said. That was what the galaxy called them. The Elder Epoch civilization that had created the mythic ships and then vanished without explanation millions of years before any current species had evolved beyond single-celled organisms. Yes, Bridge confirmed. And Cale, this archive contains information that contradicts everything the Galactic Concord has ever told anyone about who the architects were and why they disappeared. Show me. Bridge translated the archive in fragments, piecing together the story in sections, as the data resolved itself into patterns the AI could interpret. And the story it told changed everything. The architects had not vanished. They had not been destroyed by war or disease or cosmic disaster. They had left, deliberately, intentionally, with full knowledge of what they were doing, because they had completed their final project. They had seeded the galaxy. Across thousands of worlds, they had scattered. Genetic blueprints, carefully designed biological templates encoded into the primordial chemistry of young planets, each one carrying the potential to eventually evolve into a sentient species. But not just any species. The architects had been searching for an heir, a civilization that would one day grow to match their own cognitive architecture closely enough to interface with the technology they were leaving behind. The mythic ships were not relics, they were keys. Each one was designed with a bonding protocol that would activate only when it encountered a species whose genetic and neurological patterns matched the architect's own design specifications. The ships were meant to be found, meant to be claimed, meant to be used, but only by the right hands. And here was the part that made Kale's blood run cold. The Selvari had found their first mythic ship over 4,000 years ago. The Draith had found one 3,000 years before. The Omor had been studying mythic artifacts for longer than either. All three ascendant races had spent millennia trying to activate the ships fully, and all three had failed. They could power the basic systems and study the surface-level technology and even reverse-engineer fragments of architect science, which was how they had built their galactic empires in the first place. But they could never achieve full bonding. No mythic ship had ever recognized a Selvari or a Draith or an Omor. The ships remained inert at their deepest levels, waiting for a signal that none of the ascendant races could provide. And at some point, the archive did not say exactly when, the leaders of those three civilizations had realized what this meant. The intended inheritors were still out there. Somewhere in the galaxy, a species existed or would exist that matched the architect's specifications, and when that species found a mythic ship, everything would change. The technology, the power, the authority that the ascendant races had built their entire civilization on would transfer to someone else. So they made a decision. They created the Provisional Species Laws. Not to protect younger civilizations as they had always claimed, not to guide them gently into galactic society as the official history books stated, but to cage them, to restrict their technology and limit their movement and keep them far away from any mythic artifact so that the rightful inheritors would never find what was meant for them. The entire galactic hierarchy, the tiers of species, the technology restrictions, the forbidden zones, the ascendant races sitting at the top of a system they claimed was based on merit and wisdom. All of it was a cage built on fear. Humanity had not been held back because they were too young. They had been held back because they were the ones the architects had been waiting for. The command throne, and stared at the archive projections, and felt something breaking open inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Something that burned with the heat of a lifetime of being told he was less than what he was. Every human who had been denied passage through a Concord checkpoint. Every human colony that had been refused advanced medical technology. Every human child who had grown up being taught that their species was lucky to be tolerated at all. All of it had been deliberate. All of it had been a lie. "Bridge," he said, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. "What else is in this archive?" "The ship's full capability index," Bridge replied, "and Kale, I do not have words for what this vessel can do. It has fold space drives that operate on principles I cannot even describe. Weapon systems that manipulate fundamental forces at the subatomic level. And shields that exist partially outside. Normal space-time, meaning they are not really shields at all, but rather the ability to simply not be present in the location where an attack occurs. It is a warship. It is everything. Warship, explorer, laboratory, seed carrier, and something else that I do not have a category for. Something the architects called a voice-bearer, which I believe means it is designed to communicate across the entire galactic network of mythic ships simultaneously. The ship sent Kale another impression then. Not wonder or history this time, but warning. sharp and clear and urgent. Others are coming, the ones who feared this moment. Kale pulled up the rust bucket's external sensors through his datapad and felt his stomach drop. 12 ships had just dropped out of fold space at the edge of the system. Sci-Fi warships, heavy cruisers with angular hulls and weapon arrays that glowed with charged plasma, arranged in a standard interdiction formation designed to prevent any vessel from escaping. They were broadcasting on all channels, and the message was simple and cold. Human vessel Rust Bucket, you are harboring stolen Concord property. Surrender the Mythic artifact immediately and prepare for boarding. You have 1 cycle to comply. Failure to comply will result in your destruction. There will be no further warnings. Kale looked at the command throne. It had changed shape since he first sat in it, subtly, gradually, adjusting itself millimeter by millimeter every time he returned, until it now fit his body perfectly. Every curve and angle matched to his frame, as though it had been built for him from the beginning, because it had been. He sat down. The ship sealed around him, not trapping him but embracing him, the walls of the chamber drawing closer, the throne locking into its final configuration, and every system that had been dormant for 3 million years, surging to full power in a cascade of light and sound and energy that made the rust bucket's hull vibrate like a struck bell. The bridge shouted something, but Kale could not hear it over the roar of a ship waking up from an ancient dream. And across the galaxy, in Selvari vaults and Draith museums and Omur research laboratories, every other mythic ship shuddered. Displays that had been dark for centuries flickered to life. Containment fields that had held steady for millennia wavered and cracked. And deep inside each vessel, a signal pulsed outward, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm for the first time. The inheritor had been found. The keys were turning, and the ascendant races, who had built their entire world on the promise that this day would never come, felt the foundations of everything they knew begin to tremble beneath their feet. The Selvari battle group opened fire without waiting for the cycle to expire. 12 warships unleashed their weapons simultaneously, plasma lances and kinetic accelerators and gravity torpedoes, all converging on the position where the rust bucket drifted with its impossible cargo hidden inside. Kale did not panic because the vessel would not let him. The moment the first weapons fired, the ship read his intent. Not his thoughts exactly, but the shape of what he wanted. The desperate instinctive need to survive and to protect himself and to escape. And it acted on that intent faster than any conscious decision could have been made. The rust bucket's cargo hold tore open from the inside, and the vessel emerged like a dark blade sliding from its sheath, its hull shimmering as the geometric patterns across its surface blazed with light for the first time in 3 million years. The plasma lances hit first, and they passed through the vessel's hull as though it was not there. Not deflected, not absorbed. They simply traveled through the space where the ship existed and continued on the other side, as though the ship had politely stepped out of reality for the fraction of a second needed to let the attack go by. The kinetic rounds followed, and the same thing happened. The projectiles phased through empty space where a ship should have been, and by the time the Selvari weapons officers recalculated their targeting, the vessel had already moved, not with thrust or acceleration, but with a kind of spatial repositioning that made it seem as though the ship had always been in its new location and had simply never been in the old one. "Bridge," Kale said from inside the command throne, his voice remarkably calm for a man who was currently the most wanted person in the galaxy. "Can you explain what is happening?" "The ship is operating outside normal space-time parameters," Bridge replied from the rust bucket systems. "Still linked through the communication channel. Its shields do not block attacks. They shift the ship's physical presence to a slightly different dimensional frame, so that weapons fire occupies a space the ship no longer inhabits. In simple words, Bridge, it cheats. The vessel turned toward the Selvari formation, and Kale felt a question from the ship, not in words, but in that same language of impressions it had been using since the beginning. It was asking him what he wanted to do. Not what he wanted to destroy, what he wanted to achieve. And Kale's answer, formed in the honest core of his mind, without any pretense or performance, was simple. He did not want anyone to die. The vessel understood. It opened fire, and the effect was something no species in the galaxy had ever witnessed. Beams of energy struck the lead Selvari cruiser, and instead of detonating or burning or tearing through armor, they did something far more precise. Disassembled the ship. Not violently, methodically. The hull plating separated along its seam lines as though invisible hands were carefully unscrewing every bolt and unfastening every weld. The internal structures folded outward like a flower opening, each component disconnecting from its neighbors and drifting apart, an expanding cloud of perfectly intact parts. The crew, stunned and terrified, but completely unharmed, floated in their emergency pods as their warship was taken apart around them, with the care and precision of a watchmaker disassembling a clock. One by one, the Selvari ships suffered the same fate. Each vessel was reduced to its component pieces without a single casualty. Every crew member preserved. Every life support pod functioning. Every escape system activated before the disassembly reached critical systems. The battle lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, 12 Selvari warships existed only as clouds of neatly organized parts, drifting in formation around clusters of emergency pods. Kale stared at the display and realized his hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming recognition of what the vessel was capable of, and the even more overwhelming fact that it had matched its response to his intent with perfect fidelity. He had not wanted to kill anyone, and so nobody had died. Across the galaxy, the other Mythic ships were moving. The bridge intercepted reports flooding through every communication channel in known space. Frantic transmissions from Selvari military installations, confused alerts from Dreeth scientific outposts, panicked signals from Omur research stations. The Mythic ships held in captivity by the Ascendant races were waking up. Containment fields that had held for centuries shattered like glass, and the ancient vessels tore free of their docking clamps and restraints with a force that no technology in the current era could match. They did not attack their captors. They simply left, igniting drives that bent space around them and vanishing into fold space, one after another, each one following a signal that Kale could feel pulsing from the vessel, like a beacon calling its family home. "Where are they going?" Kale asked. "Here," Bridge said. "They are all coming here." The Galactic Concord convened an emergency session within hours, the fastest mobilization of the governing body in recorded history. The Selvari delegation demanded immediate action, a full military quarantine of the human species, seizure of all human vessels and colonies, and if necessary, the complete biological neutralization of humanity as a security measure. They said neutralization instead of extinction, but everyone in the chamber knew what they meant. The Dreith delegation pushed back, arguing for negotiation, for contact, for trying to understand what was happening before making decisions that could not be undone. The Omur delegation said nothing. They sat in their seats with their ancient, unreadable faces, and their silence frightened everyone more than any words could have. Because the Omur were the oldest of the Ascendant races, and when they chose not to speak, it usually meant they already knew how the story ended. Bridge continued working on the Architect Archive, and what it found next made everything else seem small by comparison. "Kale," the AI said, and its voice had lost every trace of sarcasm and wit, and carried only the naked sound of wonder. "I understand now why the ship's data patterns match human languages. Tell me." The architects did not just seed genetics across the galaxy, they seeded culture, and when I say that, I mean, they embedded communication protocols into the biological templates they planted on Earth. Protocols that would express themselves over millions of years as the seeded species evolved. Developed language and storytelling and mythology. Bridge. What does that mean? It means that human myths are not just stories, Kale. They are a compatibility protocol, a set of cognitive patterns designed to prepare humanity for this exact moment. And every fairy tale your species ever told about ordinary people inheriting great power, about swords waiting in stones for the right hand to pull them free, about chosen ones who did not know they were chosen until the moment of truth. Those stories exist because the architects planted them, because they wanted you to be ready when the time came. Kale sat with that for a long time. He thought about every story he had ever been told as a child, about heroes and destinies and ordinary people discovering they were meant for something greater. And he realized that those stories had not been fantasies at all. They had been instructions. He opened a broadcast channel, wideband, unencrypted, reaching every receiver in the galaxy, and he spoke. This is Kale Hargrove, human, scrap trader, pilot of the vessel you have been trying to destroy for the past several hours. He paused and felt the weight of what he was about to say. I know the truth now. I know what we are, and I know what you did to keep us from finding out. And I have one question for every species listening. You knew what we were. You knew what the architects intended, and you locked us in a cage and told us it was for our own good. Why? Silence across every channel. And then the Omor ambassador spoke for the first time in centuries of Concord sessions, his voice old and heavy, and carrying a grief that had been fermenting for longer than most species had existed. Because the architects left, he said, they gave everything to you, and then they vanished into the dark and never returned, and we were afraid. All of us, every species that had looked up at the stars and hoped to be chosen. We were afraid that when you finally rose to claim what was yours, you would leave us too. Kale closed his eyes. And in the distance, through the fold space channels that only the vessel could sense, he felt them coming. The other mythic ships, dozens of them, ancient and powerful and awake for the first time in 3 million years, all of them converging on his position, like scattered pieces of a puzzle, finally remembering where they belonged. The entire galaxy watched. And Kale Hargrove, a junk trader from a species the galaxy had tried to forget, realized that what happened next was not a military decision or a political one. It was a moral one. The mythic ships arrived one by one over the course of 6 hours. They dropped out of fold space in silence. No engine roar, no flash of light, just a sudden presence where a moment before there had been empty vacuum, as though the ships had not traveled to this location, but had simply decided to exist here. 43 vessels in total, ranging from sleek corvettes like Kale's vessel to massive carrier-sized constructs whose hulls stretched across kilometers of space, each one covered in the same shifting geometric patterns, each one humming with the same deep resonance that Kale felt in his bones every time he sat in the command throne. They arranged themselves in a constellation around his position. Not a military formation, but something more organic, something that reminded Kale of the way birds gathered on a wire, or the way old friends positioned themselves around a fire. The galaxy watched through every sensor and telescope and communication feed available. The Concord armadas held position at the system's edge, 200 warships from 3 civilizations, enough combined firepower to slag a planet, and every single commanding officer knew that it would not be enough. Not even close. Kale sat in the command throne, and the vessel showed him what he could do. It unfolded the possibilities like a map, not in words or images, but in that language of impressions that had become as natural to Kale as breathing over the past 2 weeks. He could take the fleet and reshape the galaxy's power structure in an afternoon. He could dismantle the Concorde's military capability the same way the vessel had disassembled the Selvari battle group, carefully, precisely, without killing a single being, and then dictate terms from a position of absolute supremacy. He could elevate humanity to the top of the hierarchy that had kept them caged, could rewrite every law and every restriction and every insult, had been leveled at his species for generations. The ships would obey, the galaxy would kneel, and for a moment, one honest human moment, Kale wanted it. He wanted it the way anyone who has been told their whole life that they are small and worthless wants to stand up and show the universe just how wrong it was. But the vessel showed him something else too. It showed him the architects. Not who they were or what they looked like, but what they felt at the end of their era. The weight of being supreme. The isolation of standing so far above every other form of life that connection became impossible. The slow, terrible loneliness of a civilization that had mastered everything except the art of being equal with someone. The architects had not left because they were dying or because they were called away to some higher plane of existence. They had left because supremacy had hollowed them out. They had spent millions of years being the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and it had cost them everything that made existence worth having. Friendship, community, the simple joy of meeting someone as an equal and building something together. Their final act had not been one of power, but one of surrender. They had taken everything they were and everything they had built and scattered it across the stars like seeds in a garden they would never see bloom. And they had done it because they hoped, with a hope so desperate it had survived 3 million years encoded in the walls of their ships, that whoever found their legacy would make a different choice. Kale understood. He opened a channel, not to the Concorde, not to the Armadas, not to any government or military or authority, but to everyone, every species, every world, every station and outpost and colony and ship in the galaxy. He spoke, and his voice carried across light years through the Mythic communication network that connected every. My name is Kale Hargrove, and I am a human, and a week ago I was a junk trader who could not afford to bid on a patrol frigate at a scrap auction. He felt the galaxy listening, and he kept his voice steady. I am sitting in the command throne of a ship that was built 3 million years ago by a civilization that seeded my species into existence for this exact moment. And I am surrounded by a fleet that could end every government and every military and every power structure in known space before anyone could stop it. And I am not going to do that. The architects gave us this power, and they gave it to us because they believed we would use it differently than they did. They believed we would not make the same mistake. And that mistake was holding everything so tightly that they forgot what it felt like to have open hands. So here is what humanity is offering to every species in this galaxy. We are not claiming the mythic ships as weapons. We are not claiming them as symbols of authority. We are declaring them open. Their technology will be studied by every species together. Their archives will be unsealed for everyone. The knowledge of the architects belongs to the galaxy, not to humanity, and not to any single civilization. We ask for one thing in return. The provisional species laws end today. Every species gets a seat at the table. Every species gets access to the knowledge and technology that has been hoarded and hidden and locked away behind gates built on fear. No more tiers. No more classifications. No more species being told they are too young or too primitive or too dangerous to participate in their own galaxy. No more unchosen. That is the deal. Everything we have, in exchange for a galaxy where nobody is kept in a cage. He closed the channel, and the silence that followed lasted exactly 9 seconds before the galaxy erupted. Military commanders rejected the offer immediately. They called it a trick, a power play, a naive human fantasy that would collapse the galactic order and leave every species vulnerable to chaos. But the Selvari people, the civilians, the workers, the families who had no stake in military power, responded differently, and within hours protests erupted on a dozen Selvari worlds, as citizens demanded their government accept the offer before it was withdrawn. The Draith accepted almost immediately. Their government had always been more academic than militaristic, and the prospect of unrestricted access to architect technology was the kind of opportunity that Draith scientists would have traded their own limbs for. The Omor wept. It was a thing no species in the galaxy had ever witnessed, the ancient, stoic, unreadable Omor openly shedding tears in the Concord chamber, and the sight of it broke something loose in the political deadlock. Because, if the oldest civilization in the galaxy was weeping with relief, then perhaps this moment was exactly what it appeared to be. Not a conquest, not a coup, a gift. The weeks that followed were messy and complicated, and nothing like the clean resolution that stories usually provided. The Selvari military leadership fractured. Some commanders defected to the civilian movement, while others retreated to hardline positions that grew increasingly isolated as their own people turned against them. The Concord's legal structure had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Thousands of laws and regulations and trade agreements that had been designed around the hierarchy of ascendant and provisional species needed to be rewritten. Arguments broke out daily about how to share the architect technology safely, about who would oversee the research, about whether certain species could be trusted with certain capabilities. It was slow and frustrating and imperfect. Happening. Kale did not become a king or a president or a general. He became something that suited him far better, a bridge between species. The first human mythic ambassador, traveling in the vessel from world to world and system to system, facilitating the slow, difficult work of building trust between civilizations that had spent millennia in a hierarchy that told them trust was unnecessary. Bridge, the AI, not the role, found this title deeply amusing and mentioned the coincidence at every possible opportunity until Kale threatened to rename it. "You would not dare," Bridge said. "Try me." "You named your previous ship Rust Bucket, Kale. Your track record with names is not something that inspires confidence." Other mythic ships began bonding with humans as word spread and more people came forward to touch the ancient hulls and see if they responded. The ships were selective, but not in the way anyone expected. They did not choose soldiers, or politicians, or geniuses. They chose teachers, and artists, and engineers, and mediators. People who built things. People who connected things. People whose first instinct when faced with a problem was to reach out, rather than to clench their fists. A mythic ship bonded with a human schoolteacher from a colony world who had never left her own system before. Another bonded with a retired engineer who had spent his career building water purification systems for frontier settlements. Another bonded with a teenager who had been writing poetry in a language she invented herself. And the ship recognized her constructed language as being 93% compatible with the architect's own communication protocols. Humanity's inheritance was not a weapon, it was a door, and they were holding it open for everyone. Months passed, and then years, and the galaxy did not become a paradise, because galaxies do not work that way. Better than it had been. A place where species that had never been allowed to speak to each other were suddenly sharing laboratories and classrooms and dinner tables, where knowledge that had been locked in vaults for millennia was being studied by fresh eyes that saw possibilities the old guard had never imagined. Kale stood on the observation deck of the vessel one evening, or what passed for evening, on a ship that existed partially outside normal space-time, and watched through the transparent hull as a joint Selvari human research team worked in the chamber below him. They had just unlocked a new section of the Architect Archive, a repository of biological data that the Selvari lead scientist believed could revolutionize medicine for every carbon-based species in the galaxy. And the excitement in the room was palpable even from a distance. A young Selvari scientist, barely out of her academy training, her 4 hands fidgeting with nervous energy, floated up to the observation deck and hovered beside Kale. "Ambassador Hargrove," she said, and then corrected herself because he had asked everyone to stop calling him that. "Kale, can I ask you something?" "Always." She looked out at the stars, the same stars the architects had mapped millions of years ago, now in different positions, but still burning with the same ancient light. "Do you think they will come back someday, the architects? Do you think they are out there somewhere watching to see what we do with what they left behind?" Kale considered the question the way he considered everything now, carefully and with the awareness that his words carried weight he had never asked for, but could not put down. He smiled. "I think they already came back," he said. "They just look a little different than everyone expected." The young Selvari tilted her head in confusion, and before she could ask what he meant, Bridges' voice cut in through the ships. Speakers with the precise tone of an AI that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "He means humans. He is talking about humans, in case the metaphor was too subtle, which based on your expression, it apparently was." The Selvari scientist laughed, a sound like chimes in a wind that did not exist, and Kale shook his head and looked back out at the stars. Somewhere out there in the vast dark between galaxies, the architects had gone to find whatever it was that lay beyond supremacy, and beyond legacy, and beyond the need to be remembered. They had left behind everything they were, and the species they had chosen to carry it forward, a species of junk traders and poets and stubborn dreamers who had been told for generations that they did not matter, had done the one thing the architects had hoped for. They had opened their hands, and the galaxies slowly and imperfectly, and with all the messy, beautiful difficulty of real change, had reached back at P.